Professor James Moriarty is a fictional character in some of the Sherlock Holmes stories written by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Moriarty is a criminal mastermind whom Holmes describes as the Napoleon of crime. Doyle lifted the phrase from a Scotland Yard inspector who was referring to Adam Worth, a real-life criminal mastermind, and one of the individuals upon whom the character of Moriarty was based. The character was introduced primarily as a narrative device to enable Conan Doyle to kill off Sherlock Holmes, and only featured directly in 2 of the Sherlock Holmes stories. However, in more recent derivative work he has been given a greater prominence and treated as Holmes' archenemy. Appearances in other works: Moriarty's first and final appearance occurred in The Adventure of the Final Problem, in which Holmes, on the verge of delivering a fatal blow to Moriarty's criminal ring, is forced to flee to continental Europe to escape Moriarty's retribution. The criminal mastermind follows, and the pursuit ends on top of the Reichenbach Falls, an encounter that apparently ends with both Holmes and Moriarty falling to their deaths. In this story, Moriarty is introduced as a crime lord who protects nearly all of the criminals of England in exchange for their obedience and a share in their profits. Holmes, by his own account, was originally led to Moriarty by his perception that many of the crimes he investigated were not isolated incidents, but instead the machinations of a vast and subtle criminal ring. Moriarty plays a direct role in only one other Holmes story, The Valley of Fear, set before The Final Problem, but published afterwards. In The Valley of Fear, Holmes attempts to prevent Moriarty's agents from committing a murder. In an episode in which Moriarty is being interviewed by a policeman, a painting by Jean-Baptiste Greuze is described as hanging on the wall. Holmes remarks on another work by the same painter to show it could not have been purchased on a professor's salary. The work referred to as La Jeune Philolophe Nue. Some commentators have described this as a pun by Conan Doyle on the Thomas Agnew and Sons Art Gallery, which had a famous painting stolen by Adam Worth, but were unable to prove the claim. Holmes mentions Moriarty reminiscently in 5 other stories: The Adventure of the Empty House, The Adventure of the Norwood Builder, The Adventure of the Missing Three-Quarter, The Adventure of the Illustrious Client, and His Last Bow. More obliquely, a 1908 mystery by Conan Doyle that was named The Lost Special features a criminal genius who could be Moriarty and a detective who could be Holmes, although neither is mentioned by name. Dr. Watson, even when narrating, never meets Moriarty, and relies upon Holmes to relate accounts of the detective's feud with the criminal. Conan Doyle is inconsistent on Watson's familiarity with Moriarty. In The Final Problem, Watson tells Holmes he has never heard of Moriarty, while in The Valley of Fear, set earlier on, Watson already knows of him as the famous scientific criminal. In The Empty House, Holmes states that Moriarty had commissioned a powerful air gun from a blind German mechanic surnamed von Herder, which was used by Moriarty's employee acolyte Colonel Moran. It closely resembled a cane, allowing for easy concealment, was capable of firing revolver bullets at long range, and made very little noise when fired, making it ideal for sniping. Moriarty also has a marked preference for organizing accidents. His attempts to kill Holmes include falling masonry and a speeding horse-drawn van. He is also responsible for stage managing the death of Bertie Edwards. Personality: Moriarty has full respect for Holmes' intellect, but is also willing to kill Holmes should he oppose him any further. He has a fiery temper, furiously elbowing aside people in the train station when Holmes escapes him, and pursuing Holmes to Switzerland to kill him for destabilizing his organization. When his men fail to kill Holmes, he pursues Holmes by himself. And when his agents fail to kill Bertie Edwards, Moriarty is implied to have done so. The only individual who appears to have Moriarty's complete confidence is his henchman Colonel Moran. Holmes described Moriarty as follows: "He is a man of good birth and excellent education, endowed by nature with a phenomenal mathematical faculty. At the age of 21 he wrote a treatise upon the binomial theorem which has had a European vogue. On the strength of it, he won the mathematical chair at one of our smaller universities, and had, to all appearances, a most brilliant career before him. But the man had hereditary tendencies of the most diabolical kind. A criminal strain ran in his blood, which, instead of being modified, was increased and rendered infinitely more dangerous by his extraordinary mental powers. Dark rumors gathered round him in the university town, and eventually he was compelled to resign his chair and come down to London. He is the Napoleon of crime, Watson. He is the organizer of half that is evil and of nearly all that is undetected in this great city. Holmes echoes and expounds this sentiment in The Valley of Fear, stating, "But in calling Moriarty a criminal you are uttering libel in the eyes of the Lawa Euro, and there lie the glory and the wonder of it. The greatest schemer of all time, the organizer of every devilry, the controlling brain of the underworld, a brain which might have made or marred the destiny of nations, a Euro that a Euro unregistered trademark as the man. But so aloof is he from general suspicion, so immune from criticism, so admirable in his management and self-effacement, that for those very words that you have uttered he could hail you to a court and emerge with your Euro unregistered trademark as pension as a solatium for his wounded character. Is he not the celebrated author of The Dynamics of an Asteroid, a book which ascends to such rarefied heights of pure mathematics that it is said that there was no man in the scientific press capable of criticizing it? Is this a man to traduce? Foul-mouthed doctor and slandered professor, such would be your respective roles. But a unregistered trademark S genius, Watson. The smaller university involved has been claimed to be one of the colleges that later comprised the University of Leeds. But in Sherlock Holmes, the unauthorized biography, the smaller university is said to be Durham University. Conan Doyle's original motive in creating Moriarty was evidently his intention to kill Holmes off. The final problem was intended to be exactly what its title says. Doyle sought to sweeten the pill by letting Holmes go in a blaze of glory, having rid the world of a criminal so powerful and dangerous any further task would be trivial in comparison. Moriarty appeared in only one book as the author felt having him constantly escape would discredit Holmes, and would be less satisfying. Eventually, however, public pressure and financial troubles impelled Doyle to bring Holmes back. A point of interest is that the high, domed forehead was seen as the sign of a prodigious intellect during Conan Doyle's time. In giving Moriarty this trait, already apparent in both Sherlock Holmes and the detective's brother Mycroft, Doyle may have intended to portray Moriarty as a man having an intellect equal or greater than that of Holmes, and thus the only man capable of defeating him. Moriarty's personal history. Moriarty is an ancient Irish name, as is Moran, the surname of Moriarty's henchman, Sebastian Moran. Conan Doyle himself was of Irish Catholic descent, educated at Stonyhurst College, although he abandoned his family's religious tradition, neither marrying nor raising his children in the Catholic faith, nor cleaving to any politics that his ethnic background might presuppose. Doyle is known to have used his former school, Stonyhurst College, as inspiration for details of the Holmes series. Among his contemporaries at the school were two boys surnamed Moriarty. The stories give contradictory indications about Moriarty's family. In his first appearance in The Final Problem, Moriarty is referred to as Professor Moriarty, no forename is mentioned. Watson does, however, refer to the name of another family member when he writes of the recent letters in which Colonel James Moriarty defends the memory of his brother. In The Adventure of the Empty House, Holmes refers to Moriarty on one occasion as Professor James Moriarty. This is the only time Moriarty is given a first name, and oddly, it is the same as that of his purported brother. To wit, The Valley of Fear, Holmes says of Professor Moriarty, he is unmarried. His younger brother is a station master in the west of England. Simon Newcomb and other real-world role models. In addition to the master criminal Adam Worth, there has been much speculation among astronomers and Sherlock Holmes enthusiasts that Doyle based his fictional character Moriarty on the American astronomer Simon Newcomb. Newcomb was revered as a multi-talented genius, with a special mastery of mathematics, and he had become internationally famous in the years before Conan Doyle began writing his stories. More to the point, Newcomb had earned a reputation for spite and malice, apparently seeking to destroy the careers and reputations of rival scientists. Moriarty may have been inspired in part by two real-world mathematicians. If the characterizations of Moriarty's academic papers are reversed, they describe real mathematical events. Carl Friedrich Gauss wrote a famous paper on the dynamics of an asteroid in his early 20s, and was appointed to a chair partly on the strength of this result. Srinivasa Ramanujan wrote about generalizations of the binomial theorem, and earned a reputation as a genius by writing articles that confounded the best extant mathematicians. Gauss's story was well known in Conan Doyle's time, and Ramanujan's story unfolded at Cambridge from early 1913 to mid-1914. The Valley of Fear, which contains the comment about maths so abstruse that no one could criticize it, was published in September 1914. Irish mathematician Des MacHale has suggested George Boole may have been a model for Moriarty. Jane Stanford, in That Irishman, suggests that Conan Doyle borrowed some of the traits and background of the Fenian John O'Connor Power for his portrayal of Moriarty. The model which Conan Doyle himself cited in The Valley of Fear is the London arch-criminal of the 18th century, Jonathan Wild. He mentions this when seeking to compare Moriarty to a real-world character that Inspector Alec MacDonald might know, but it is in vain as MacDonald is not so well read as Holmes. It is averred that surviving Jesuit priests at Stonyhurst instantly recognized the physical description of Moriarty as that of the Reverend Thomas K. S.J., prefect of discipline, under whose aegis Doyle fell as a wayward pupil. According to this hypothesis, Doyle as a private joke has Inspector MacDonald described Moriarty, he'd have made a grand minister with his thin face and grey hair and his solemn-like way of talking. Depictions and references, radio. Orson Welles played Professor Moriarty opposite Sir John Gielgud's Holmes in the 1950s series broadcast of The Final Problem. In the BBC Radio November 4, 1992 broadcast of The Final Problem and February 24, 1993 broadcast of The Empty House, Moriarty was played by Michael Pennington. In the BBC Radio March 1997 broadcast of The Valley of Fear, Moriarty is eventually revealed to be the narrator of the story. The narrator was played by Ronald Pickup. On The Goon Show, Spike Milligan played a character, Count Jim Moriarty, which has sometimes been implied to be based on Professor Moriarty. In the 1999 BBC radio comedy series The Newly Discovered Casebook of Sherlock Holmes, Moriarty was played by Jeffrey Whitehead. Film: Norman MacKinnell appeared as Moriarty in the 1931 film Sherlock Holmes' Fatal Hour. Booth Conway appeared as Moriarty in the 1916 silent film The Valley of Fear. Lynn Harding portrayed Moriarty in The Triumph of Sherlock Holmes and Silver Blaze. George Zucco appeared as Moriarty in The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. Lionel Atwill appeared as Moriarty in Sherlock Holmes and the Secret Weapon, in which he is working for the Nazis in World War II. Henry Daniell appeared as Moriarty in The Woman in Green. Moriarty is the only character in the Sherlock Holmes films to have been killed off 3 times in the same series. All deaths occurred in the Basil Rathbone Nigel Bruce Holmes films, and all 3 involved him falling from a great height. In The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, Holmes throws a straight left into Moriarty's jaw, sending him through a battlement and off the top of the Tower of London. In Sherlock Holmes and the Secret Weapon, Moriarty fell 60 feet into a sewer. In The Woman in Green, he fell from a high building when a drain pipe that he was clutching onto broke. Leo McKern portrayed a comedic Moriarty in The Adventure of Sherlock Holmes' smarter brother. Laurence Olivier appeared as Moriarty in The 7% Solution. However, in this version he is not the story's villain, but merely a harmless man who becomes an increasingly paranoid victim of Holmes' delusions, based on the fact that Moriarty indirectly contributed to the death of Holmes' mother, who was his lover. In Young Sherlock Holmes, Anthony Higgins plays Holmes' schoolmaster, Wraith, who turns out to be an evil mastermind. During the long credit roll at the end of the film, Wraith is seen walking to an inn and signs the ledger as Moriarty, indicating he will become Holmes' archenemy. Higgins portrayed Holmes in Sherlock Holmes Returns, making him one of only 2 actors to portray both Holmes and Moriarty on film. In the Disney animated film The Great Mouse Detective, the character called Professor Ratigan is an obvious parallel and tribute to the character of Moriarty. Basil also describes Ratigan as the Napoleon of crime, the same designation Holmes gave Moriarty in The Final Problem. After his plan to replace the Queen fails, Rattigan is killed when he falls off Big Ben after a clash with Basil. Rattigan was voiced by Vincent Price. Paul Freeman appeared as Moriarty in Without a Clue. The film revolves around the premise that Holmes is a fictional creation of Watson, who is the real crime-solving genius. Moriarty is apparently aware of the deception, with Holmes clearly terrified at the thought of facing him, although he shows his skills when facing Moriarty in a duel at the film's conclusion. Anthony Andrews appeared as Moriarty in Hands of a Murderer. Vincent D'Onofrio appeared as Moriarty in Sherlock, Case of Evil. In The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, the film adaptation of the graphic novel by Alan Moore, Richard Roxburgh portrays the main villain named the Phantom, whose true identity was eventually revealed to be Professor James Moriarty, who also posed as the League's recruiter M. With a blackmale Dorian Gray as his agent, Moriarty acquired samples from the League with the intention of duplicating their powers for his own goals. 3 clues to the Phantom's real name were subtly slipped into the course of the film's dialogue. In the climax, Moriarty alludes that he somehow survived his confrontation with Holmes at Reichenbach. After a confrontation with Alan Quatermain ends with him stabbing Quatermain in the back while he is distracted, he is shot down by Tom Sawyer while trying to escape. Roxburgh also portrayed Holmes in the 2002 TV adaptation of The Hound of the Baskervilles, making him one of the only 2 actors to portray both Holmes and Moriarty on film. In the 2009 film, Sherlock Holmes, Moriarty appears as a shadowy, mysterious villain employing Irene Adler. The role is uncredited, although rumors circulated that the character was played by Brad Pitt, who had expressed interest in playing the character. Judd Harris played the role in the sequel, Sherlock Holmes, A Game of Shadows. In addition to his credentials as a mathematical genius, celebrated author and lecturer, he is described as a boxing champion during his school days at Cambridge, and a close friend and consultant of the British Prime Minister. Mycroft Holmes describes Moriarty as one of England's foremost intellectuals. During the film, he attempts to provoke a war using advanced weaponry that he has developed while sending an assassin into a crucial conference using an early form of plastic surgery. With Watson having deduced his assassin's identity while Moriarty is occupied in a chess game with Holmes, Moriarty and Holmes clash, with the fight ending as Holmes pulls Moriarty over the edge of a balcony into a waterfall, knowing that he cannot defeat Moriarty in a direct fight due to a recent injury and wanting to protect Watson from Moriarty's revenge. Although Holmes is shown to have survived at the end, Moriarty's fate is left ambiguous. In the 2010 Warner Brothers cartoon Tom and Jerry Meet Sherlock Holmes, Moriarty appears as a jewel thief and was assisted by some evil cats. A comparison to his role in the Red-Headed League is also made. Television: Eric Porter portrayed Moriarty in 2 episodes of The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, starring Jeremy Brett as Holmes, The Red-Headed League, and The Final Problem, and briefly in the Return of Sherlock Holmes episode, The Empty House. The first 2 stories were filmed in 1985, with Jeremy Brett as Holmes, and David Burke as Watson, and the third in 1986 with Edward Hardwicke taking over the role of Watson. He also appeared as a hallucination in the Return of Sherlock Holmes episode The Devil's Foot. In the feature-length episode The Eligible Bachelor, Holmes describes Moriarty as a giant of evil, and says, Moriarty combines science with evil. Organization with precision. Vision with perception. I know of only one person that he misjudged. Me. I regret Moriarty's death, because without him, I have to deal with distressed children, cat owners pygmies, pygmies of triviality. In the cartoon Sherlock Holmes in the 22nd century, Moriarty was the one behind nearly all the crimes. He had been cloned back to life by a rogue geneticist, requiring Holmes to be resurrected as well in order to match him. The body of the original Moriarty was still covered in ice behind the waterfall he fell from during his battle with Holmes. John Huston portrayed Moriarty in the made-for-TV movie Sherlock Holmes in New York opposite Roger Moore's Holmes, attempting to rob the Bank of New York while threatening Irene Adler's son to prevent Holmes from investigating, although Holmes and Watson are able to rescue the son and solve the crime, regardless. In the Soviet series of television films The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson by Igor Maslenikov, Moriarty was played by Viktor Yevgrafov and voiced by Oleg Dahl in the second film of the series. In the Russian-produced Sherlock Holmes and Sherlock Holmes series by Andrei Kovun, Moriarty was played both times by actor Alexei Gorbanov. A holodeck simulation of Professor Moriarty, played by actor Daniel Davis, appeared in the Star Trek: The Next Generation episodes Elementary, Dear Data, and Ship in a Bottle, accidentally achieving an artificial sentience when Geordi LaForge asks the holodeck to create an opponent able to defeat Data. Moriarty appears as a holographic character in the Futurama episode Kiev Gets Knocked Up a Notch, where he comes out of the holosh of the Nimbus with Attila the Hun, Jack the Ripper, and Evil Lincoln. In The Strange Case of the End of Civilization as We Know It, Connie Booth plays Moriarty's granddaughter, Francine, who is disguised as the modern-day Mrs. Hudson. In The Batman, The Brave and the Bold episode Trials of the Demon, both Holmes and Watson guest star. Watson mentions Moriarty, suggesting he might be the one responsible for stealing the souls of women. Holmes quickly ruled out Moriarty as a suspect based on the choice of weapon. Elementary My Dear Winston, the third episode for the 1989 season of The Real Ghostbusters, features Holmes, Watson and Moriarty by way of belief made manifest. So many people believed in them that they became real. Moriarty now has supernatural powers and employs the Hound of the Baskervilles as his henchman. Holmes and Moriarty are both sucked into the Ghostbusters storage facility while wrestling, in the same manner as the conclusion of The Final Problem. Anthropomorphic incarnation of Moriarty appeared in the anime series Sherlock Hound, voiced by Chikao Oetsuka for Japanese and Hamilton Camp for English. During the series, Moriarty is the main villain behind every crime in almost each episode. As many characters were depicted as anthropomorphic dogs, Moriarty himself is seen closely resembling Wolf. James Jim Moriarty is played by actor Andrew Scott in the modern-day BBC adaptation, Sherlock, as an extremely volatile consulting criminal, who develops a murderous obsession with Holmes. In the Series 2 finale The Reichenbach Fall he frames Holmes and threatens his friends to drive him to suicide. He seemingly shoots himself to make sure Holmes commits suicide. However, at the end of his last vow, his face appears on TV screens across the country as a mostly static image, only the mouth moving, similar to that of a ventriloquist's dummy. Moriarty appeared in 2 episodes of the animated series Brave Star. In the U.S. television series Elementary, Moriarty is equated with Irene Adler. As with Moriarty, she is first mentioned in the 12th episode of the first season. Holmes tracks an apparent serial killer who uses the name M. Upon his capture, he is discovered to be Sebastian Moran, Moriarty's henchman, whose seemingly random murders were actually assassinations carried out for his employer, whom he claims to have never met. In the season finale, Irene Adler is revealed to be an alias created by Moriarty in order to get close to Holmes and observe him. The episode Where Everyone reveals her true name as Jamie Moriarty and she continues to write letters to Sherlock from prison. In the Russian television series Sherlock Holmes, Moriarty is a mathematics professor who attempts to assassinate the Queen. He appeared as the head of a London-wide criminal network called the Cabman Gang. Theatre: in the William Gillette play, Moriarty was played on Broadway in the original run by George Wessels, then by Frank Keenan, John Milton and Philip Locke, Clive Revill and Alan Sues from 1974 76. In the play Sherlock Holmes by Uda Rathbone, which ran at the New Century Theatre in New York City for only 3 performances from October 31, 1953, Moriarty was played by Thomas Gomez. Jeremy Brett and Edward Hardwicke played Holmes and Watson in the Sherlock Holmes TV series made by Granada Television. Eric Porter played the Professor. In the late 1980s, Brett and Hardwicke appeared in the stage play The Secret of Sherlock Holmes by Jeremy Paul, a regular contributor to the series. The only characters in the play are Holmes and Watson, and it highlights many aspects of their relationship from their first meeting to the Reichenbach Falls. In the second half it is indicated that Moriarty never existed, he was a figment of the imagination of Holmes who needed a worthy enemy as much as he needed a devoted friend like Watson. In The Final Problem, Watson and Moriarty never actually meet in person. Literature. T.S. Eliot, a fan of Sherlock Holmes fiction, used the phrase the Napoleon of crime in homage to describe McCarthy in Old Possum's Book of Practical Cats. There are further likenesses between the two as T.S. Eliot talks of McCarthy's virtues in stealth, his tall and thin stature with sunken eyes and a domed forehead. All of these descriptions are matched precisely to the Moriarty of Conan Doyle. In Neil Gaiman's Hugo Award-winning short story A Study in Emerald, the Moriarty and Holmes of an alternate history reverse roles. Moriarty is hired to investigate a murder. The murder has apparently been carried out by Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson. The story is narrated by Colonel Sebastian Moran, given the rank of Major by Gaiman. In Detective Comics 572, the 50th anniversary of Batman's first appearance, Batman and several other DC characters met descendants of Moriarty and Dr. Watson. Professor Moriarty appeared in a flashback sequence. A 135-year-old Holmes had a brief cameo at the end of the story. In a 2006 comic book story featuring Lee Falk's The Phantom, the 19th Phantom has to fight Professor Moriarty. The climax of the story features the Phantom and Moriarty falling down a waterfall in the Bangala jungle. At the end of the story, Moriarty is shown to be alive, as he returns to London to find a detective named Sherlock Holmes. Dorothy Sayers' story The Adventurous Exploit of the Cave of Ali Baba is consciously modelled upon the final problem. Lord Peter Wimsey is apparently killed, only to return from the dead at the end of the story and reveal he had faked his death in order to trap a very dangerous super-criminal. The debt to the original Doyle story is explicitly acknowledged in Sayers' story, in a passage in which Wimsey refers to the criminal he is tracking as the Moriarty of this gang. In Nicholas Mayer's 1976 novel, The 7% Solution, Professor Moriarty is portrayed as Holmes' childhood mathematics tutor, a whining little man with a guilty secret. He is incensed to hear that Holmes, apparently under the influence of cocaine, has depicted him as a criminal mastermind. Due to Holmes' worsening condition, Moriarty threatens to tell the authorities about Holmes' addiction. Dr. Watson seeks the help of Sigmund Freud, who uncovers the truth behind Holmes' perception of the Napoleon of crime. This is one of many works to seize on the fact that Moriarty never actually shows his face in the Holmes canon. The novel, The 7% Solution, was made into a 1976 film and starred Laurence Olivier as a very different sort of Professor Moriarty. In the 1979 novel, Enter the Lion, a posthumous memoir of Mycroft Holmes, written by Michael P. Hodel and Sean M. Wright, Gerald Moriarty, the father of the Moriarty brothers, is Mycroft Holmes' immediate superior in the Foreign Office and plays an important part in a plot by former Confederate officers to involve the British government in a scheme to overthrow the United States government. His exposure by Mycroft and Sherlock leads to his suicide to avoid arrest, for which Professor Moriarty blames the Holmes brothers, and provides an explanation as to the antagonism between Sherlock Holmes and Professor Moriarty. The professor himself makes 2 appearances in the novel. Michael Kurland wrote a series of novels in which Moriarty is the hero. His crime organization is the method whereby he raises funds for his experimental physics apparatus. In the first book of the series, The Infernal Device, he foils a plot against Queen Victoria, reluctantly allying with Holmes. John Gardner has written 3 novels featuring the arch-villain, The Return of Moriarty, in which the professor, like Holmes, is shown to have survived the meeting at the Reichenbach, The Revenge of Moriarty and Moriarty. In these novels, Moriarty is depicted as a Victorian-era Al Capone or Don Juan, single-handedly controlling London's organised crime structure. The professor is not really Moriarty, but Moriarty's younger brother, also named James, and as brilliant as his older brother, whom he impersonates, disgraces, and murders, later stealing the deceased man's identity. Moriarty appears in Alan Moore's The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. Recruited from university by British intelligence, he supposedly set up his criminal empire as part of an undercover operation to monitor crime in London which got out of hand, to the point where the cover became more real to Moriarty than his role in British intelligence. Having survived the encounter with Holmes, He went on to become head of British intelligence under the codename M, but still maintained his criminal interests. He instigated the creation of the League as a cover-ops unit with plausible deniability and used them to recover an anti-gravity mineral called cavorit which had been stolen by his crime lord rival the Doctor. He used the cavorit to bomb the East End of London in an attempt to destroy the Doctor but was thwarted by the League which had uncovered the double cross. Following his supposed death, he was ironically succeeded as M by Mycroft Holmes, Sherlock's older brother. In the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, Black Dossier, it is suggested that Jack Kerouac's Dean Moriarty is his great-grandson, and the rivalry between the two criminals is continued by the fact that the Doctor's great-grandson is Kerouac's other creation, Dr. Sax. In the third volume, set more than 6 decades later, Mina Murray comes across his carcass, still holding on to the cavorit inside a block of ice floating through space. Kim Newman's novel Anno Dracula depicts Moriarty as the spokesman of a league of villains drawn from popular fiction. In this Moriarty is a vampire and is no longer interested in criminal pursuits as he now has an eternal life which he can dedicate to intellectual contemplation. Newman has also written a series of short stories about Moriarty, narrated Watson-style by Colonel Moran, in which Moriarty interacts with many of his fictional contemporaries. They have been collected in Professor Moriarty, The Hound of the D'Urbervilles. One of the stories, The Red Planet League, first appeared in Gaslight Grimoire. Another story, The Adventure of the Greek Invertebrate, features Professor Moriarty's 2 brothers, also named James, the Colonel and a station master, and offers an explanation for the lack of variety in their forenames. The last story, The Problem of the Final Adventure, retells the adventure of the final problem from the other side, revealing there was more going on than Watson realized. Commenting on Nero Wolfe's prolonged struggle with the powerful crime boss Arnold Zek, Michael Durdey, a book critic for The Washington Post, wrote, "I was thrilled when Wolfe finally encountered his own Moriarty in the arch-villain Arnold Zek." British author and literary critic David Langford noted that the relationship between Zek and Wolfe may be seen as comparable to that of Moriarty and Holmes. Philip Josa copyright Farmer's science fiction steampunk parallel novel The Other Log of Phileas Fogg asserts that Moriarty and Jules Verne's Captain Nemo were one and the same person. Moriarty appears in a short story by Donald Thomas, in his collection The Secret Cases of Sherlock Holmes, as the mastermind of a blackmail plot involving the alleged bigamy of Prince George. His younger brother, Colonel James Moriarty, appears as the antagonist of another short story in Thomas' The Execution of Sherlock Holmes. In the mandala of Sherlock Holmes, set during Holmes' 3-year fake death, Holmes encounters Moriarty during his trip in Tibet, where he learns that Moriarty is actually the Dark One, a former Tibetan mystic possessing great psychic powers who lost his memories in an attack on the Dalai Lama, only for his near-death experience on the Reichenbach Falls to restore his memory, albeit leaving him horribly crippled and disfigured by his injuries. He attempts to acquire a legendary crystal that would allow him to wield even greater power, but, although Moriarty acquires the crystal, boosting his powers and healing his injuries, he is defeated when it is revealed that Holmes is partly possessed by the spirit of the Dark One's old rival, allowing Holmes to wield similar powers to Moriarty's and delay him long enough for Holmes' ally, Hure Chunder Mukherjee, to knock the crystal away from Moriarty and into Holmes' hands, allowing Holmes to turn Moriarty's powers against him, vaporizing his body and destroying him once and for all. In The Beekeeper's Apprentice by Laurie R. King, an elderly Holmes and his proto-copyright copyrightee, Mary Russell, are pursued by Moriarty's middle-aged daughter, also an Oxford mathematics don, and a criminal kingpin in her own right, who threatens Holmes' remaining friends as she attempts to force Holmes to kill himself after signing a fake confession admitting he framed her father as a criminal out of jealousy and that most of his cases were solved by others. The detective provokes her by noting that her father essentially committed suicide by confronting Holmes in such an isolated spot without any weapon, which results in her accidentally shooting herself while struggling with Mary Russell. In the Italian comic book Martin Mr. Moriarty wasn't killed at Reichenbach Falls. Both he and Holmes survived and continued with their previous works. At the beginning of World War I, Moriarty stole a formula for poison gas from the British government. When he attempted to sell the formula to the Central Powers, he was discovered by Holmes, who killed Moriarty, but only after Moriarty managed to fatally wound Dr. Watson. In Anthony Horowitz's 2011 novel, The House of Silk, the first official Holmes story since Doyle's death, a chapter is dedicated to Watson's meeting with a secretive criminal mastermind. This character is not definitively identified, however it is heavily implied that he is James Moriarty. Watson later states that he believes this to be the case, and in an appendix Horowitz states the identity of the character outright. In various books and David Webber's Hanover series, the name Moriarty has been applied to a defensive weapons system developed by the Republic of Haven. The system is deployed as a missile fire control system, for system defense against naval assaults. The concept, while easily countered by mistletoe missiles, is nonetheless the inspiration for the Manticore and development of the Mycroft defensive weapons system in A Rising Thunder. In Artemis Fowl, the first book in the young adult Artemis Fowl series by Eoin Colfer, Leprechaun officer Julius Root remarks about the criminal mastermind Fowl's criminal activities and his abduction of Officer Holly Short, too much damned TV. Thinks he's Sherlock Holmes. Foley corrects him, saying, "That's Professor Moriarty." Holmes, Moriarty, they both look the same with the flesh scorched off their skulls. In Paco Ignacio Tiburtio's The Return of the Tigers of Malaysia, Dr. James Moriarty appears as the mastermind behind the attacks on Sandokan and his friend Yanis. Video games. In the video game Portal 2, Wheatley mentions Holmes and Moriarty, comparing Chell's pursuit of Wheatley to the endless fight of Holmes and Moriarty. In The Lost Cases of Sherlock Holmes, Moriarty is unmasked as the villain in the 16th and last mystery, but while his scheme is foiled, the professor escapes when Holmes must focus on disarming a bomb inside the Big Ben clock tower. In the computer adventure Sherlock Holmes, The Awakened, Holmes encounters Moriarty locked in a Switzerland mental hospital in 1895, where the professor has suffered severe brain injuries from the falls. Not recognizing Holmes in disguise, Moriarty is tricked into thinking his nemesis is in the hospital lobby, and charges from his cell in a frenzy, giving Holmes a diversion so he may investigate the asylum's secrets further. By the opening of the sequel, Sherlock Holmes vs. Arsène Lupin, or Sherlock Holmes, Nemesis, there has been no word of any mental recovery or escape attempts by Moriarty. Holmes remarks to Watson, "If there had, we would be on the way to Switzerland already." In The Testament of Sherlock Holmes, Moriarty is the main antagonist who tries to frame Holmes and create anarchy. In Wizard 101, the character Moriarty is based on Professor Moriarty. References. External links: The Final Problem, The Valley of Fear, Sherlock Holmes Public Library.